Hello, everyone. We are live from New York on our diversity and inclusion series. This is our fourth episode, 3 weeks in the lockdown. And tonight we have two amazing experts. We have Chrisa, who's joining us from New York, and Michael Kirtley, who's joining us from Paris. Jan?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. It's great to see everyone again. My name is Jan Mercer-Dahms, and I'm the Vice President of U.S. Development with Mayshad Choice. And as you know, Mayshad is an ecosystem of brands for women by women. We champion women professionally and personally through our digital series, through our technology platform, and through our innovative programming designed to help women to connect to each other and to the organizations, companies, and causes that champion equity for women. And thrilled to be a part of this conversation. And I'm so happy to see that we have a global presence with us here today to talk about all things related to diversity, inclusion, and equality in this moment of COVID-19. Thank you, Neza.
Thank you, Jan. So Michael Kirtley is a well-known international photojournalist, filmmaker, nonprofit founder, communication advisor, and world traveler living in Paris, France. Chrisa Zindros Boys is an executive coach at Handle Group. Her clients, an international base of serial entrepreneurs, corporate executives, and established individual contributors, hail from a broad range of sectors, including finance, legal, media, entertainment, fashion, technology, and government. Michael, as you are joining us from Paris, and I guess it's very late there. Thank you so much for joining us at this time. So I would like you to talk to us a little bit about the World Memory Film Project, which is your nonprofit organization, and how would the Memory Film Project cover these times of COVID-19?
Well, thank you, Neza, and thank you everyone who's on the call. And first of all, before I forget, congratulations on everything you've done with Mayshad. As you know, I've kind of followed the development of Mayshad from the very beginning, and it's pretty extraordinary to see it broadcasting from New York City. So congratulations.
Thank you, Michael.
I think that
it's one of the first supporters of the Mayshad ecosystem. Thank you.
Well, it's always been a pleasure. And I think that this particular period begs the question, how is everybody going to come out of it? As you know, the World Memory Film Project that I created a few years ago took as its basis that you can interest people in subjects that maybe they didn't even know they were interested in, as long as you ask them to be creative. And in that particular case, a few years ago, I tackled the subject of genocide, because I felt that genocide was something extremely important in terms of how people view one another. Even if a problem doesn't go as far as genocide, there's always racism, or there's always some sort of prejudice that puts people down, and could eventually lead to massacre and genocide, as we've seen in different ages. So but the problem was that whoever you talk to, they just kind of turned away. I mean, it's too sad, too grim a subject to talk about. So I said to myself, how do you attract people to something that needs to be talked about, needs to be thought about, but that nobody wants to talk about and nobody wants to think about? And at that time, we started using the idea of everybody could create their own little film. So thanks to help from the United Nations, from you in Morocco, from other people, we launched this worldwide campaign for people, especially young people, because they didn't have the same kind of prejudices perhaps that older people did, to send in their videos. And the response was amazing, because number one, they were able to get beyond the grimness and talk and create art. Like some people would create dance, people would create poetry, songs, along the theme of treating each other better to avoid getting to that point. I think that today we're in a period which kind of leads to that kind of prejudice sometimes among people. There's so much fear going around right now. one of my neighbors in the same building I live here in Paris is a world-renowned epidemiologist, and he's very concerned. He's on the front lines all the time, and what he sees is that a lot of the people that he relates to in his daily life just don't get it. They have no idea. They get news from people on the right, people on the left, people who have conspiracy theories, people that have no idea about what science is, or people that do. And they're all very confused, and most of them are extremely scared. And oftentimes what that leads to is aggression or aggressivity. For example, today, one of the things they're talking about in Paris is they allow you to go out jogging, but all of a sudden there is a resistance on the part of older people against joggers. And we try to figure this out. Where is this resistance coming from? And now it turns out that they're afraid that people are going to either, because they're exhaling very, very hard, or they're going to just release some sort of liquid, and that's going to fall and they're going to get coronavirus. And so I've experienced it myself. My wife has experienced it herself, that people get aggressive and say, get away from me, stay far away. And so what is that? My question is to myself is, what is that going to lead to afterwards? Because the other side of the coin is that there's a lot of good in kind of stopping our lives for a while and thinking about what's realistic and what's real, thinking about what's positive in our lives. And so I think that what's really going to be important is that people like we are, who are very accustomed to social media and who are accustomed to thinking about how people think and how people remember things, because that's, you're talking about memory. The memory of this particular event is going to be extremely powerful. How do we actually start communicating? Because I'm very afraid that it's going to be just as polarized as the politics are today.
Well, this is the role of the world memory films. It's to remind people of crisis like Genesis and today this human crisis. We talked about it a few years ago when we were presenting the world memory film together in some conferences, and we speak about it in our D&I conversation. Ignorance leads to racism. When we ignore the facts about other cultures, other races, or about this virus, that's what leads to some imagination that takes on to aggressivity. So, Jan, I would let you continue with a great question for Chrisa, I guess.
Hi, Chrisa. Thank you so much for joining us as well. So very different industry, but I'm sure that a lot of the themes that Michael just mentioned will probably come up in our question here, Chrisa, with you as well. You're a management consultant working with high-performing, high-achieving C-suite CEO types, and around things such as leadership, conflict resolution, negotiation, and just how to step into your role as a leader. And I would assume that during this period of time that there are so many things coming up for you and your clients that you're experiencing. And interesting to know, what are some of your aha moments right now in the work that you're doing with your clients?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here with you guys. So yes, it's been a very interesting time. Whenever you're doing any sort of leadership development or leadership coaching, we're always talking about how can leaders be visionary and how can they always be on the front line of innovation. But like never before has that become so important as this virus, because what happened when this virus really hit us is that businesses had to pivot. And all of a sudden, we went from having structures and cultures that worked one way for many, many years, all of a sudden had to turn on a dime and figure out a way to be productive and retain clients overnight. So the top conversations I'm having are around this idea of how do we pivot, but pivot smart, both for the short term to retain clients, but also for the long term, because we know that when we go back, it's not going to be the same world. There's some positives to that it won't be the same world, like yay. But also it's going to take a long time for everybody to get back in life as it once was. So while most of us are looking at sort of the end of April as a time where maybe this quarantine will be lifted, we really do realize that likely there's going to be a rolling deployment of people going back to work. And what does that look like? So how do we maintain corporate productivity? How do we maintain communication and structure? So for the leadership conversations I've been having, it's all about vision, being really clear on like what it is that you are going to stand for. So whatever goals were going to happen in 2020, we've had to revamp them. But now, what are you standing for? What are you believing in? And then what are you daring to believe in this time for your business? Like what is going to be possible for you, regardless of the current circumstances? What are you really taking on, having that clear vision, and then being able to innovate in that? And so for some companies, that means, having enough technology. Many companies were caught off guard because there weren't enough laptops so people can go home and work from home. I have friends who work in the law field, and there weren't enough computers, or they don't have databases to access their client files. Yet again, I have clients who worked in entertainment, and they don't have the technology to be able to manage their business remotely. So these are things that CEOs and leaders are having to look at now, and it's a really important conversation because our world is going to go back, and now is the time to really start to evaluate these things. So that's in the bigger scale. Go ahead. Sorry.
Follow-up question was around, so there's a lot of logistical constraints and issues to be solved, just in the sense of how do you do remote work? Mm-hmm. And then there are larger issues around culture and inclusion. Mm-hmm. And are leaders able to balance those two mindsets right now? And if so, what are some of the themes that are coming up for you in your work?
Yeah, so there's this interesting conversation between the duality of like creating corporate structure around being able to work from home, so the operations of it all, and logistics, as you just mentioned, Jan, but then the culture. So it's almost funny that this is still something that we get surprised by, but culture and employee morale is so important. So the companies that have a great level of employee morale, where senior leadership is continuously filtering information, they're in constant communication about what's happening, employees know where like the monies are, they're clear on where the business is coming from, they're in pretty good standing with the organization, and they're connected and still engaged. But in the companies where that's never been strong, we're starting to see a lot of employee disengagement and a lot of drop in productivity. And so the bigger conversation that we're having from a culture standpoint is that leaders are now having to shift how they think about productivity. So most of us think about productivity in the true sense of shift work. We all do the day shift, right? We all work from 9 to 5, and we sit at our computers and we sit there and we get work done, and we're just kind of like at our desk. But when you have a work from home culture, that actually doesn't apply anymore. One, because we're at home and we're managing families and children and everything, but then also because the science says it doesn't work. The science tells us that really working about 3.5 to 4 hours at a time is the most productive a human can be, and then we need breaks. So companies are really dealing with this culture shift and making it acceptable for people to take more breaks during the day, break up their workday into different chunks of time, and then also figuring out how to maintain the morale through frequent communication and filtering of details.
Thank you, Chrisa.
So, Chrisa, where does the culture of inclusion stands in what you're saying? I guess it has an importance as well. In this shift, like today, how can we maintain the inclusion, and how can we take it to the next level after this crisis?
Yeah, so there's like the theme of making sure you're being sensitive to your workers. Mm-hmm. Sensitivity is really important here, and there's a level of relatability. I think for the first time in a long time, leaders are also contending with these extraneous factors. Like they are also working from home with their family and their children. They are confined as well. So it's making us a little bit more considerate. But the truth is sensitivity to the various type of workers that are at home trying to juggle everything. So you might have workers who are in their 50s and their 60s taking care of elderly parents and maybe running errands for them and need to not be available in the mornings for meetings. You might have like your middle-aged workers trying to manage homeschooling, and you might really need to be okay with the little kid popping their face up on a Zoom call in the middle of a day. Or, one of the expectations we've all gotten into, which is great, we can use virtual technology, but a lot of times, if you have little children and they have to go outside, or you need to, move them around so they're not stuck inside all day long, the working mom or the working dad may really need to do the Zoom call via like calling in versus being on the screen. So we have to be sensitive to all these things and create space for people to really be productive and focused. Even if they're present, sometimes they're not going to be focused. So it's better to make the right spaces and concessions so people can be the most focused. And then the next component really is providing that level of assurance to your people. That's direct communication. It's filtering the communication of what's happening and where things stand. But assurance also includes removing roadblocks. So this morning, it's probably a good example. I did a training, and most of the people on the call were probably in their like late 50s to like mid 60s. And there was a lot of technology challenges just because it's not how people used to work. It's not something they use all the time. And that's a roadblock for people. So if we're asking them to work from home and be productive, where can you support them via training that's real and applicable for right now, whether it is technology or changing how you do your schedule, or changing how you do your start and stop times to work, or even when you allow emails to go out in the evening. All these are ways that we can continue to support people and be inclusive.
You know, it's interesting that we're talking so much about, obviously, technology, because that's what's kind of binding the world together right now. But Michael, you've been using technology to tell a story and tell stories for a very long time, with the right mix of your own creative process around social, video, crowdsourcing, and individual memory. Talk to us a bit about that creative process and what that means for you and what that's meant for the people that you inspire through your work.
Well, sure. I'd like to add a little bit to what Chrisa was just saying. My wife works in a very large company, and all of a sudden, I mean, obviously this was an invisible lightning bolt that hit everybody back 2.5 months ago, and I think there were lots of companies that just, I mean, and countries that weren't at all prepared. And so all of a sudden, all these people were told to go home and work. And I think that what she's noticed, and she might not have predicted this, but what she's noticed is just how difficult it is to go all the time without any social interaction with her colleagues. You know, just being able to, maybe she would say, I would prefer to work 2 days a week at work and 3 days at home if I had to, but 5 days a week all the time, weeks on end, you lose that sense of connection. And I think that to answer your question, what I've always sought is a kind of interactivity. In other words, when I would inspire people to work on crowdsourced videos, or more recently, I've kind of conducted an experiment. I've produced a film from Paris with an editor who is in Los Angeles. And we never were in the same place during the editing of this film. We shot the film together because we were on location, but we had, I said, well, can it be possible to produce a film, a very high quality film, at a distance? I mean, no producer that I've spoken to actually thought that was possible. It turns out it turned out quite well. But part of the reason it turned out well was to learn what are the things you need to do to be able to communicate. Because so many things that we're doing in our daily lives, we think we're communicating, but we're actually sending signals. And those signals come from when we're in front of a person, when we're looking at the same paper together, and when suddenly that's taken away, we have to figure out what are the little building blocks that we need to create in order to know that the other person is hearing the same thing I'm saying. And so, fortunately, I've kind of lived a life ever since I was young where I never depended on going to the office. I worked with National Geographic, and almost everything I did was setting up whatever I was doing at a distance from my home in America or in Paris, by phone call at that time, or fax. Today, of course, by email, that sort of thing. But so I'm kind of adjusted to what it means to communicate to people who don't know. But today I recognize that if whatever the post-COVID world is going to be, it's definitely not going to be the same. And I hope that what we're going to learn is more about, as Chrisa was saying, more about a culture of communication.
You know, I think that you're absolutely right in the sense of the way in which we communicate, how we continue to touch other people's lives, even now when we can't actually have the face-to-face handshakes or the hugs or the kisses. And I'm wondering, on the other side of this, in how we think about humanity and relationships, what would, and this question is actually to both of you, but Michael, maybe we start with you and then move to Chrisa, from the sense of what do you hope that this period of time inspires in all of us, just in the sense of how we think about humanity on the other side?
Well, that's a good question. It is one I think any thinking person thinks about that, right? You think, well, gosh, there must be some good that needs to come out of such a horrendous period. And the first thing you think of here in Europe is you think of the environment. For example, I go out on walks and runs in Paris now, and before my lungs would burn, now they don't burn anymore. And on a very simple level, you can see that there is a change that somehow has a positive aspect to it. You see that people are more concerned. They're talking. I mean, I talk to people. Obviously, you don't run into that many people under the kind of social isolation we have here in France. But the ones I do talk to are very concerned about what the post-COVID world is going to look like. And you see, I think, the other side of the coin, which is there's a lot of divisiveness. In Europe, you see so many countries that are closing themselves off, either because they're trying to protect themselves from the virus, or they're taking advantage of the situation. Certain Eastern European countries, especially, to kind of establish a more autocratic way of governing. And so there's certainly a political element to what's going to be the post-COVID world. It's interesting for me to look at what's going on in America. For example, we have, you would have thought, as happened after 9/11, that faced with this kind of unseen enemy, kind of like an alien coming in from Mars, you would have thought that people would rally together and come up with a joint effort towards fighting this, or at least they'd listen. But without blaming anyone for the situation today, what I am noticing from a distance is that America doesn't seem any less divided than it did before COVID. So what's going to happen after all that? And so the answer that I see to this is that it's going to need some very strong leadership. It's going to need people who actually stand up and inspire us. I always go back to the example of a man that I know quite well, Nelson Mandela, who was able to take a very divided country in the aftermath of apartheid and inspire his nation to become, at that time anyway, a united nation of white and black people working together towards a similar goal. Well, I think that leadership, in whatever the goodness that comes out of this, will be the most important factor.
Thank you, Michael. Chrisa?
Yes. So I really do think this is all for a better humanity. I'm really taking that stance personally and believing in that. I think that after all this, there will really be a shift in some of our habits. After having to be in a space where we all have to cook and stop spending money on things that we necessarily don't need, I feel like we're all confronting sort of like, what is it that we really do need? What are our priorities? What are important things for us to have in our life? So I think holistically, from like a society and a culture standpoint, we're going to notice a shift in sort of what our desires and wants are going to look like after this. That's not to say humans will be humans and that we won't want things and we won't want to buy stuff and be entertained and have sort of instant gratification. But I think there's some level of beauty to be said for being able to slow down and refocus on some of the fundamentals. But from the lens from which I always look at things and from where I work, my hope really is that after all this, there are really great policies that have been implemented and put in place for organizations and for people. Things like, unlimited time off, sick pay, better maternity benefits for people, healthcare, what we call like non-compensation benefits. So people's ability to maybe have flexible working schedules, all these things that really help employees and companies function better and work together in a way that allows for people to have a balanced life. My hope after this is that that's what we're going to go see. And I do know that many companies are working on that. They are taking this time to take a step back and they're realizing, oh my Lord, without sick leave, what would we do? Or, oh my Lord, without childcare for my employees, like how would I take care of them? How would they show up? And so I'm really feeling this is like the right push that we needed to make that a reality.
You know, it's interesting that I think that the mental health industry here in the United States is going to take on a whole different meaning as we come to grips with the anxiety and the stress and the depression that many people are experiencing during this moment in time for so many different reasons, right? And, you know, Chrisa, and the work that you do with HR executives and leaders, has that been a point of conversation in the sense of broadening how we think about healthcare provisions in the United States? And Michael, then interested to get your opinion from a global perspective as well.
Yes. So a really good question. And yes, it's been a very interesting shift. So in the last few weeks, I have seen more calls from HR departments and leaders about how can you help my people be happier at work and be more productive? And normally I don't see those calls. I see calls about I need them to like make more sales or bring in more business or, you know, get this stuff done. And it's been a complete 180. And people are realizing the importance of mental well-being and taking care of people, and even just providing them with tools for how to cope with stress, how to cope with like, you know, overwhelm or procrastination, and not just like anxiety. So it's been a real interesting moment in time. In addition to that, one of the things that's been really heartwarming to go see is that leaders are really investing in their people even after they have maybe decided they're going to furlough them or lay them off. And so there's been a lot of contribution to providing mental therapy sessions or coaching sessions as part of the package that they're giving people, which I think is such a beautiful offer since we're all contending with so much stress at this time. So it's been really great to see. Many companies have stepped up. It's been very impressive.
Well, I actually have an interesting lens here, living here in France, because as you might know, the French healthcare system is a national healthcare system, and so the dichotomy between the American system and the French system is very poignant and visible to me. And what I would say is that I do hope that in America we start thinking about what they're seeing overseas, because when I hear what's going on in America right now, and it sounds like a huge cacophony, people are trying to compete against each other for ventilators, for beds, for hospitals. I mean, here in France, I mean, in Paris, which is experiencing a situation almost as critical as New York's, what they're doing is they're looking, where are the beds in France? And so they're taking patients from Paris and putting them on these fast speed trains and sending them by train down to cities that are far away from Paris, because they know they can find hospital beds and ventilators there. In other words, the treatment of the sick people here is just so much more streamlined than it is in America. But moreover, I think this is the more important thing, is that creates a lot less stress on the population, and therefore on employers. I mean, I've often been amused to see American employers resist the idea of nationalized healthcare, when what I see here, for the most part, even though they might complain about the charges that they have to pay for it, at the end of the day, it becomes very systematic. When it's good, it becomes systematic. For example, you know that if the doctor tells you he says you shouldn't go to work this day, he writes out a little paper. The company already has it in his system. We're going to accept that. They're not going to question that. Nobody's going to say, oh, you don't deserve to do that, or you're doing something bad to take that day off, or something like that. So it just lowers the whole stress level to have some of those problems, which are very apparent today in the aftermath of COVID-19. I think it would really help America to reanalyze how they can make life less stressful. Because one of the things that I think that all of us have noticed is the internet, no matter how many wonderful things it's brought to us, it's brought a lot of stress. And just trying to respond to the constant call of the internet is very stressful. So if there is something that's really positive to come out of this, I think it's that people will understand that having a little more time and a little less stress in their lives is a good thing. and hopefully they'll translate that into the aftermath.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Chrisa. I would like to share, before going to the next question, two paragraphs from Arundhati Roy's Financial Times essay. She's a female Indian author and political activist for human rights. And as we're wondering a little bit what will be the aftermath of COVID-19, I think her text is very pertinent. So historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with a little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So clearly what is said here, and I think what we're all a little bit intuitively realizing, is that this is going to change the world. And so we can either resist to that change or just use this time to re-question everything in our life, to reposition ourselves for the future and go on with that light baggage of what we're deciding to keep and prepare for what the future is going to be. And hopefully with much more humanity, much more inclusion. And as leaders, as you said, Michael, we don't, fortunately have a Nelson Mandela at the head of our countries. And so I think we're also each one, and we're definitely missing a lot of, we've been missing a lot of leadership on a political level for the past decade. And so we need to take the leadership on our own community, on our own groups, whether it's our team or our group of friends or in our community. So the next question is for you, Michael. In the aftermath of 9/11, you put in place a great initiatives, which was the Friendship Caravan. So you took ambassadors, as you were living in DC back then, if I remember, and you engaged ambassadors from several countries to be part of this nurturing initiative, understanding among people of diverse culture. Can you tell us what the Friendship Caravan could be after COVID-19?
Well, actually, the situation is somewhat similar in the sense, as you just pointed out, the world after COVID-19 will not be the same as the world before it. And that's also something that can be said about 9/11. And I recognized that pretty quickly. I recognized that on the 20 minutes after I saw the towers fall, that the world wouldn't be the same. And yet, the prediction was, and I think unfortunately has turned out to be true, that it would end up with a lot of hatred towards a community, the Arab and Muslim community, that part of which was responsible for causing 9/11, rather than saying, well, did we have a part in this at all, or something like that. So I tried to turn this into a positive, and we were very successful. It's very interesting because people were at first, for the first year or year and a half, Americans everywhere, and that I was involved with literally millions of Americans, because at the peak we had 8 million followers, and I mean, this is not the followers on internet. This is followers that were actually, going to watch us on TV and things like that. So what I noticed is that everybody wanted to have hope at that point that the world could be a world of fellowship between people. There were people that would come, you would never think they would actually want to participate in an activity that would have them shaking hands with Arabs, for example. You never would, but they would, because we were able to convince them that somehow, by stepping back, relaxing a little bit your feelings, relaxing your convictions, you might actually see something that interests you. So for about a year and a half, 2 years, we did so many different activities across America and across the world that both in the creative realm and in the educational realm, we work with lots of schools. And what I noticed is that little by little, people started getting hardened. They started losing that hope that they had. So it seems to me that a great trauma like 9/11 was also a harbinger of hope, at least at that particular time. I think that that's going to happen also with COVID-19. I think that once we come out of this, there are going to be people that say, well, can we do something to avoid this again? Number one, okay? So probably there'll be a lot of money thrown into protecting against future pandemics. But there's also going to be a recognition, and I kind of share Chris's feelings about this. There's going to be a effervescence of desire to change for the better. And I think it's up to us, those of us who feel that already, who feel that potential, to help people. And just to finish on that note, in listening to you today, what I hear is solutions. What I hear are activities. I think the real key is also stepping back and relaxing. One of the things we learn from this period is that it's not so bad to take a breath, you know? And so I would hope that as leaders, we also encourage people to not need to fill up their days 60 minutes an hour with everything. And Chrisa sort of alluded to that with what she's seeing from some of the leaders that she's working with. I think that is an extremely important thing, because we also have to have the time, in my opinion, to accept the change.
Well, Michael, you can't blame us for focusing on solutions. You know how obsessed we are with solutions at Meshad. We're always trying with our positive mind and angle to think solution through this time. But I totally agree with your point that this is also a moment to step back and to take the time, I think, to meditate throughout the hours, and that all solutions don't come through activity. They also come through like my moments of silence, and where we're letting things come to us as well.
Neza, I don't know if our friends know this about you, but Neza is one of the best I know in finding ways to disconnect. And I remember she would go on these trips into the Sahara, and she would relax with the people there, and she would come back stronger. Because living with stress in your daily life is just going to create more stress. And Neza has done that better than anybody I know, so she can teach us all.
Well, I do miss my long times in the Sahara. So people compare a lot, especially here in New York. We've been comparing what is happening now to 9/11. And so this is a question that comes from someone from our team. My sentiment is that society comparing COVID-19 is insensitive to what happened to those people on that day. Many people had the power and choice to avoid contracting the virus when people didn't have a choice when it came to 9/11. What do you feel about that? How do you feel about this comparison to 9/11? Chrisa,
I'll take it. Yeah. So I feel that comparisons sometimes allow us to make something relatable when we haven't seen it before and don't know how to put language to it. It allows us to sort of point to something that is close enough. And so I think that for all people, this moment in time is some level of trauma and tragedy. Whether it's because you've lost someone very close to you, or you yourself have gotten impacted, or you've lost your job, or your husband or your spouse has lost your job, we're all feeling some level of impact and a level of grief. And when you're feeling that level of grief, it's hard to not relate to other moments where you felt grief before. And for those of us who lived in New York City or like were around New York City during 9/11, there was this level of like completely out of control. You couldn't, like, things were shut down. You had no say. All you can really do is go inward and just control what you could control, which was your mood and your space and just what you were physically doing with your body at any given moment. And this period of time is very similar. We don't have control over when things are going to open up, when the stock market's going to go back, when people are going to start hiring again. And it feels very not only scary, but also as if like it's changing. So scary and changing in the moment, meaning we don't know when it's going to stop. And that takes a toll on people. And one of the things, that we all know about humans is we don't love change. We don't like change. We become very constricted over change. We don't tend to expand during change. And because of that, we can be very judgmental and we can really be stuck in our own assumptions about things. And that's a natural fear response. So I think we have to have space for everyone to grieve this moment, however they need to grieve it. And for our own sanity, because we're all getting bombarded by all this information and the news and the death tolls and people losing jobs or friends getting laid off. For our own sanity, be committed to being in a non-judgmental space and let people have whatever grieving experience they need to go have.
Michael, in Paris, what was the comparison? Because I think that comparison to 9/11 is typically for people here in New York. Did people, especially at first, it was something new. Definitely, the world has never seen a global shutdown at the same time. But was there an element of comparison to historic moments in Paris?
Well, yes, for sure. People do talk about 9/11. They also talk about the bubonic plague, and they. I think that most people who I hear, keep in mind, I'm not in all the homes finding out what everybody's thinking, but the thinkers in France, they do compare it to 9/11 in one sense, and that is to say that there's a huge difference. In 9/11, we felt we understood what the enemy was. Here we know what the enemy is, but we have no idea how to face that enemy, at this particular point. So it also creates, at this point anyway, a feeling of helplessness, maybe a can-do attitude, but we can't just go out and bomb a cave somewhere in Afghanistan. That's not going to do anything for us. That's not even going to relieve our feelings. About all that we can do, whether we're in France or in America, is make sure somebody has a hospital bed. That's not very much reward for the fear that we have. And politicians know this. Politicians are very good, and we're very good at 9/11 in making those bombings on different places. And whether you liked it or not, it was effective in responding to what the population needed or what they thought they needed at that time. Here, all we have are people who get up in front of a microphone and tell us either good news or bad news, but they're not telling us necessarily true news as far as we know, okay? They're trying to make us feel more hopeful. And so I think that today, it really depends, and the French are saying this, it really depends on how long it lasts. Right now, we're still in the sort of infancy of our reaction to this situation. If it ended tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, probably within 3 or 4 weeks, we'd be back to the same life we had before, more or less. If it doesn't end until July or later, there might be a totally different thing. People are going to get fed up. People are going to they're going to start going crazy. There's going to be so much more mental problems that people facing this. And there's going to be
violence.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I mean, you see that. I was reading an article today about the problems faced by African Americans who don't want to put on a face mask. Why? Because they're afraid that, this is the image of African Americans among many white Americans, and that is that if they're hiding their face, they're going to do something bad. So they don't want to be shown to the outside world as potentially criminals, And so you have this kind of dichotomy that exists between what we are thinking about, most of us living relatively comfortable and relatively contained existences, not threatened directly by what's going on, and all these other people out there that don't have that kind of comfort zone.
I'm wondering also, and Michael, picking up on your thoughts around who is the enemy in this, right? And we know what the enemy is, you're absolutely right, and we don't know how to stop it. But then we've also humanized and created an enemy around the construct of the other, right? And so when we think about, for example, companies who, and Chrisa, maybe you could speak to this as well, who have difficulties with helping their employees understand that Asian Americans, it's not right to single them out and target them for harassment within a company setting. Or for those companies that have furloughed hundreds of thousands of employees, when most of those employees are either women or people of color, because those are the ones that are most often serving on the front lines, whether it's retail or hospitality or whatever you have, right? And so the question pertains to the implications of race and class in this moment right now, as we see it unfolding in the US. And then Michael, also interested from your perspective, from a global perspective as well. Chrisa, we'll start with you.
Thank you. So it's a big question. There's like, it's so multi-layered. I think there's something that Michael was saying earlier that I want to point to, and Nessa spoke about this when she read the excerpt. There is a real moment where, because there isn't a defined, like, true enemy that we can go bomb over there, and it really is an opportunity for us to take responsibility for ourselves. So what's going to make the social distancing and the flattening of the curve even possible is if for each of us, we're responsible for staying away, mitigating our own risk, not interacting with other people, and really following the guidelines that have been outlined by the professionals to get this under control. So there's a moment in which humans don't really love being responsible. I wish we were different, but we kind of don't like to. We don't love to be responsible. We like to point blame. And in fact, when we don't feel like we're being productive or effective, that's when we love to blame, right? It's like somebody else's fault. It's the government's fault. It's the boss's fault. It's whomever. But this is an opportunity that says, no, actually, as a collective, each of us matters for actually making an impact here. So we're really seeing how, even though we all, kind of sit siloed in our worlds, how much we really do impact the masses. So for me, the first component of this conversation is like being able to look inward and taking real responsibility for yourself as like a citizen of the world, and being smart about your moves, and then also knowing that your moves are going to contribute to the success or lack thereof of flattening this curve and stopping this epidemic or this pandemic and getting the world back to normal. So there's that piece. In regards to companies, like looking at what are we going to do now with all these employees that we have furloughed or laid off, we reacted. And I think that, when we get scared, we react. Usually, impulsivity doesn't lead to great decisions. But I think many companies had to make a move. They had responsibility to shareholders. They had responsibility to their consumers. They had to make changes. But one of the things that this is an opportunity for us to go look at, and I mentioned it earlier, are the policies that we have around how do we take care of our employees, and even those on the front lines. Because who would have thought, 3 months ago, that grocery store workers were like, frontline workers and essential employees in our society. If the Amazon man doesn't deliver my packages, I don't know what I would do in my day. Like, how else am I getting anything? All right, I'd have to wait in the line at Whole Foods for like 3 hours to get groceries. So there's a real sort of perspective shift. So for companies, I think this is a matter to be looking at what types of policies do we have to invent. Literally, they haven't existed before. We haven't looked at our employee rules and regulations like this in the past. What are we going to invent in order to make sure that going forward, the populations of people who work for us, whether it is those higher wage workers or the ones that are in the front lines and tend to be lower wage and more ethnically diverse and or more women, are being protected? Because guess what? We're going to need them back. And if we have insulted them and not taking good care of them, they're going to go to companies that are going to take better care of them. So if we want to make sure that we have healthy, strong companies, we need to make sure that we are thinking about how we're going to make it up to people that we treated pretty poorly during this time.
Here in France, 2 points. First of all, the kind of situation that you're describing in terms of companies letting go minorities or women first, probably isn't nearly as big a problem here because generally speaking, women are treated and minorities, at least in big companies, are treated pretty equally both in terms of wages and in terms of layoff policies. In fact, I would say that it would have been shocking to me if my wife had been laid off before somebody else, just because she was a woman. I mean, that's even a foreign concept here. You wouldn't even think about that. And I think that gives a lot of, and also there are lots of social welfare circumstances that exist in France to help mothers that have children, or even to help you take care of your house if you really need it. So it's a little bit different here. My wife is Vietnamese, so when it first came out that Asians were being discriminated against, and I first heard about that in France. Later, I heard about it in England and in the United States, and it turns out that the problems there are much bigger than they are here. So at that time, I was wondering what's going to happen when my wife's name is Ben. When Ben goes out for a walk or a run, I mean, is something going to happen? Or takes the metro. At that time, she was still taking the metro, and I must say that she hasn't had any experience that was negative along those lines. Although we were at least thinking about it, we weren't concerned. We were just thinking about it. I hear that in America, it's a lot worse situation today. And I think it might be partly because the reason that there's not, I mean, people always try to find a scapegoat, and I'm sure here in France, the French people are just like American people or British people. They will try to find a scapegoat if they can. But they don't seem to be scapegoating particular groups of people, except maybe for poor people, because poor people tend to live closer together, and therefore there's the feeling that poor people are contributing to the spread of the disease. That does exist, that type of feeling. You hear people talking about, oh, that place over there, you don't want to go there. Those people just don't know how to live. They're going to give us the disease because they're poor mainly. I haven't heard too much at this point anyway of a prejudice against a particular racial group. Now, there is an interesting exception to that on a political level. There's definitely some anxiety and even resentment towards America right now and towards Americans. Not because, people love America in general here, and they would love to see America taking a greater lead in this whole problem. But they don't feel that America is leading the world in trying to address this issue. And you can tell that that's a vacuum. People talk about it here. It doesn't affect me personally. I mean, I don't have any problem with the French people or in France, but you hear people talk about that.
So I'm wondering, from both of your perspectives, as we think through what the next few months look like, what are some active steps that we individually as leaders and owners and entrepreneurs can do to change that global sentiment, which we know exists for many, many different reasons, in the sense of actions that possibly we could have done at the federal level to combat this much, much sooner, right? And so now here we are, but we only can control what we can control. And through the autonomy and the empowerment of us as individuals, what would you like to see us do differently? And Michael, let's start with you, and then Chrisa, you can add to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, for me, it's on a very personal level first. You might know this, Queen Elizabeth gave a speech the night before. And one of the things she did in that speech is something that I've been writing to journalists, I've been talking about it on radio and things like that, is she actually thanked those of us who were staying at home. She said, we are the first soldiers in the battle, and this is a war. And you have to think about that it's a sacrifice to stay at home. It's a sacrifice to actually follow social distancing and to not go out and have a party somewhere. But here in France, and I haven't heard it in America yet, nobody among the leadership is actually taking the time to thank those people, those millions and millions of people who have given up their existence because somebody theoretically told them that if you do that, things are going to get better. It's a very theoretical war in that sense. So I think the first thing that we can do is lead by example. I'm an adventurer. I love to go anywhere and everywhere at any time that I can. My wife is the same way. It really hurts us to think that we're confined, to think that we're even imprisoned in a way. But on the other hand, we realize that everybody's thinking something like that, right? And so if we're not capable of doing the right thing ourselves, we can't expect it of other people. So I think the first thing is by giving a good example. And the second thing is to personally, I think about this all the time, by the way. I think, what can I be doing? Certainly NEZA, in developing this kind of program, is offering a major service to thousands of people. And I keep asking myself, what can I do? And maybe I'll come up with something. Right now, I haven't. I've been trying to adjust my own self. But I think 3 months, if this crisis indeed endures over the next 3 months, we're going to see some very serious economic problems in just about every country. Part of the world that I spend a lot of time in is Africa, and I just dread to think what's going to look like in many countries in Africa 3 months from now, especially since they're going to be cut off from the rest of the world. I think that part of what we can do, sort of like what Chrisa was alluding to, is prepare for the aftermath in smart, humane, and compassionate ways.
Michael, thank you. I think, just by participating to this program and bringing your international perspective, that's a way to contribute to what we're personally doing here at Mayshad. But I know that you're also active in other international media. So giving a voice to inspire and empower people in those times is very important, because we took the time to adjust ourselves, and throughout that adjustment, I think we all have something to share in how to take it, how to cope with it, and to also push people to start looking at the aftermath of this, and to be patient as well, because as we know, it might not just take a couple of weeks. That would be ideal, and we would come out of it with having had this kind of like home retreat for a month, and then we're going back stronger. But unfortunately, the reality is that it might take longer, and we need to be prepared for it. Chrisa, thank you so much for giving us your perspective on what is happening in corporations right now, as we're all curious to find out, especially when we're solopreneurs, entrepreneurs. We want to know how those big corporations are dealing with this situation, and how are they preparing the future of their company, and how are they treating their employees. Jan, would you like to have a closing?
Sure, yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Neza. And Michael and Chrisa, you are amazing. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your wisdoms and your hopes for remote work as we know it now, and for how we come out on the other side of this, and inspiring that innovation and positivity that I know that we're all that's all within us, right? And I know that it's interesting because at Mayshad we talk to so many different women around the country, and what we're realizing is that we're kind of all in this at a different place too. Many of us have been remote working for far longer than others, and I think that for us, Neza, Chrisa, and I are in New York, and we encourage everyone, to Michael's point, it's the things that we can do at an individual level to really respect 6 feet of distancing, to really stay at home and not engage with the outside world, because there will be another side to this, right? And I think that we'll see so many moments of possible transformation, both at a macro level and within ourselves at a micro level as well. Thank you so much to all of you out there. Thank you so much for being with us again. Please, please, please visit joinmayshad.com to learn about all of our upcoming events. Like we said, we've taken everything digital. We're now doing 5 events per week, live streamed. And also next week, we're launching our workshop series as well. So please reach out to us to learn more about what's down the road for that. And thank you, everyone. Please keep sending us your questions and thoughts as well. Want to make sure that we're providing the best programming to you to help you and your teams and your companies manage positively through this period of time. Thank you, everyone, for being with us here today.
Thank you.